Good day. I want to continue with offering you some more content and discussion to help prepare you for the Action Inquiry Group peer feedback sessions, and just continue with some of the material that I was presenting to you the last time we had a full class together. So in preparing for the Action Inquiry Groups, there's a couple of things I just want to bring to your attention. First, I'm going to be submitting some materials for you on our D2L site for you to review. There's a document that's about guidelines for offering peer feedback and comments. There is a sample case from a long time ago, so this is not a student at UGA, and it gives you some example of a case and the kinds of comments that I've offered. I'm also want you to review Torbert's parts 1 and 3 just to get a freshening up of the kinds of action inquiry approaches and processes that he describes. I also have offered a book chapter that I wrote with one of my colleagues, David McCallum, that takes this method and kind of integrates it with Theory U, for those of you who know that, but also for applications for leadership. And there's a great article that really describes collaborative developmental action inquiry by Foster that I also have there. So please do those, at least the book chapter and the article reading for sure, and then review Torbert's work before March 4th. Though we will only start our inquiry groups and probably only have time for maybe one in each group, I'm thinking I'd like to model the process first. So I will be asking for some volunteers, and I will speak to those of you individually who I think are ready to kind of do a mock process with me based on previous experiences with me. So look out for those emails. And what follows, I just want to kind of really go a little bit deeper in terms of inquiry, and particularly integrating both Edgar Schein's view of inquiry and Bill Torbert's view of inquiry. So this notion of inquiry, and I use the language of force pretty intentionally here, because really starting to cultivate an inquiry stance is very different than a stance that is maybe habitually grounded in task or relationship. So, since we've done the DISC, you now know what your orientations are. Like those of you who are more task-oriented, the D's and the C's, and those of you who are more relationship-oriented. Of course, both of you are oriented towards getting things done, right? You're both action. All four of the quadrants are actionable. But now you know where your preferences are. So now that you know where your preferences are and you know kind of where your edges are, how do you really maintain a kind of whole openness, or a kind of noticing that despite or in spite your preferences, you have some extra work to do if you happen to be somebody who doesn't pay attention to relationships so much and are overly driven by task. And that affects the way that or rather the quality of inquiry. So one of the fantastic forces of developmental action inquiry, the kind of methodology that we're going to be putting into practice in a couple of weeks together, is that it is simultaneously starting to grow this muscle, if you will, of how to pay attention to yourself, like, how you speak, how do you establish a rapport, how do you work with offering feedback to your peers and your colleagues. So that's your first person action. So you're paying attention to yourself in action, in the action of giving feedback. And you're going to be giving feedback from a distance because you're reading each other's work and your own leisurely time providing feedback. But when we actually do or apply this methodology, we will be in class where you will be offering your feedback live. So paying attention to your first person. What is your stance? That's what first person is. What's my stance for inquiry? How do I inquire? And do I keep in mind what my preferences are around task and relationship? And how does that influence the quality of my inquiry? The second person is, how do I pay attention to the quality of co-inquiry, where I'm in conversation, in discussion, in the meeting with a group of people who are working together to explore something, to decide something, to delegate, to assign roles and responsibilities. So the second person space is that interpersonal space. So in that space, how do you take up your stance as a leader, with a perspective to inquiry, right? Open, a humble inquiry, if you want to use Edgar Schein's language, or actionable inquiry, if you want to use Torbert's language. And then third person is paying attention to what's the impact. So what's the impact of my inquiry? How does it land on the person, on the group, and on the system? And how do you know how it lands? So, in your action inquiry groups, you have an opportunity to pay attention to how does my way of offering feedback, of asking questions, of challenging and supporting my peers impact them, and how does it impact them differently, and then why? And then as a group, how does the quality of my inquiry help shape the kind of trust and respect and authenticity that we cultivate as a group, so that we can have some mutual learning happening in our space? And then in a system, how do I apply that stance of inquiry to work with my colleagues, my peers, my subordinates, my, higher ups, and what impacts do I have? So how do you start to pay attention to your first person, second person, and third person quality of inquiry? That's really what I want you to start paying attention to. And it really is at the heart of how we are developing ourselves as leaders of change. And change here is action, right? So all of you are in positions of, or want to be in positions where you are seen as responsible, as adding value, as making contributions, and of being of benefit. Another way of looking at how you're holding yourselves, what's the quality of your inquiry, is to go back to the 4-quadrant map that we have been looking at since the beginning of this class, which is how do I keep in my awareness my first person interior disposition, right? Myself, my interiority. For example, how does my dominating dimension on the disc influence the way that I act in the world? And only you're aware of that, right? So what's your, particular recipe for how you act as a high I, or as a high D, or as a high S, or a high C, or, when your opposite is being challenged? And all of you know that I'm very challenged in the C domain. So I know that under conditions of stress, when I feel like I have to perform in this very controlled and, operational, clear way, it causes me a lot of anxiety. So now that I know that, how do I anticipate that? How do I, regulate that? How do I ask for help around that? So that's all related to my first person inquiry based on my third person upper left, so third person singular experiences, right? It's only through trial and error that I start to figure out, how my thinking and my action are sort of matched or not matched in my fields of practice. The second person lower left side of the quadrant here, this interior culture, climate, relationships. Yeah, so how do I pay attention to myself in relationship to you, to each other, in my classrooms, in my leadership positions? How am I interacting? Now, those of us who are high I's, we're pretty good at this, and it comes fairly naturally. At the same time, we can also galvanize a lot of pain if we're not careful, and a lot of pleasure if we are careful, for the whole group. We really are very capable in that way. And the lower right hand, which is the third person at the systemic level, what's the impact of my inquiry, on the system, my group, my unit, my division, my department, my team, my small group, right? So I want you to start to really pay attention to these 4 different territories of your experience. And especially as you do your action inquiry case peer inquiry groups, you're going to have an opportunity to pay attention to those 4 territories, both based on your cases, but also in each other's cases. And I hope that's going to provide a rich experience for you and your learning. So Edgar Schein does a very nice job at really looking at sort of the qualitative differences of the types of inquiry or approaches to inquiry, as he calls them. And I just want to very quickly go over them. You can read more in more detail, of course, in the book. However, I think it's really important to pay attention to these different approaches, because different situations require a different approach. It's not that one approach is better than the other. So this notion of humble inquiry, though it maximizes curiosity, minimizes bias and preconception, it demands that you have a real good sense of your first person territory, right? So in order for you to exercise that approach to inquiry, well, you better have a very high sense of level of self-awareness, really willing to pay attention to ongoing data, right? Data that comes at you from experience, being able to really look at experience in the midst of action. So I think that this kind of approach to inquiry does require high level of self-awareness, high level of interpersonal awareness, and then real willingness to take in feedback from the exterior system or structure or space that you're acting in. I like this diagnostic inquiry, I think, is very interesting, because I think in situations where maybe you are leading a discussion or you're wanting to influence a kind of opportunity to explore with others, then really being able to take up this position of influencing and, recognizing how you can apply these different approaches to inquiry based on the situation. I think that's that's a refined application of inquiry based on, how you're starting to even develop the practice or even know what inquiry is for you, right? So right now, don't worry about kind of being maybe, I'm not quite sure yet what my stance is, because you don't know. You're in the process of really discovering that, paying attention to that, and that takes time, right? And that's going to take probably more time than this course allows. But over time, I think if you pay attention to this, it really does start to provide an excellent foundation for the way that you take up your own way of being a leader. This confrontational inquiry, which I think I already said, that's my habit basically, culturally, and because that's probably the high D part of my ID sort of scores on a disc. But this is really, it can come from a place of consciousness when you really are conscious about wanting to insert your ideas, but using framing, right? So I'm trying to integrate now Bill's work. Bill uses, framing, advocating, illustrating, and inquiring as forms of inquiry, or what he calls forms of speech. And this notion of confrontational inquiry can be dangerous if you don't frame really well, and if you begin to hide your advocacy for inquiry. And I think I've given you some examples around that, of advocacy hidden in inquiry would sound something like this. You want to have pizza, don't you? Right? That's a leading question. Clearly, I want to have pizza. I'm hoping to persuade you to have pizza too, rather than saying, I'm kind of hungry. What are you hungry for? Right? That's genuine inquiry, which includes you and the person who you're having a conversation with. Now, this process-oriented inquiry, I think, really does get as close as you can get to what Bill Torbert means by keeping in mind the 4 territories of experience as you're engaging in inquiry. I mean, I think that's what's so dynamic about the methodology. It's how do we learn how to diagnose and pay attention to what's going on in the midst of our action, in the midst to our thinking, interpreting, making meaning, deciding, right? So this process-oriented inquiry focuses really in the present. So it's not stacking, anticipating what's going to happen, nor is it future-oriented, which is trying to strategize before really paying attention to the here and now. So I think that here and now-ness means, are you willing to take the risk to ask when you don't know? To present your vulnerability, when you're uncomfortable with making mistakes or being seen as not knowing. So those are going to be the qualitative nuances that I want you to be paying attention to as you engage in your inquiry groups. This is a very, I think, simple illustration again of how you are simultaneously keeping in mind the practices of the 4 parts of speech, the territories of experience in your mind as you're paying attention to the cases of your peers and your own, and then noticing where action can be adjusted, reframed, revisioned, become more open or spacious. So Bill Torber does a really good job of describing these 3 domains for purposes of the methodology. So please go and revise those chapters in, I think it's part 1 and 3 in the Action Inquiry book. So 4 parts of speech is really at the heart of the action of inquiry that Bill Torbert talks about. So where Edgar Schein is really talking about dispositions towards or approaches towards inquiry, Bill's work is really looking at, well, what's the practice of that kind of inquiry? So he uses the formula of the 4 parts of speech to really bring alive or intentional focus to how you actually are speaking. So he talks about framing as the first part of the speech act of inquiry. So framing is basically saying, here's my thinking. Right? So really putting yourself in the game, so to speak, really being clear that this is how I'm framing what I'm about to say. And then advocating is about asserting an opinion, basically saying, look, given this is my perspective, my framing, here's what I'm advocating for, my perception or my feeling or a strategy for action. And then in order to support your advocacy, then you want to illustrate, So you want to say, hey, look, for example, this part of my case, or this is what I saw in your case, or here's an experience I recently had. That's all illustration based on yourself, not looking at someone else, but really putting yourself in the place for being seen, for being open to change, being open to feedback and comments, and ending your speech act with inquiry, right? So what's a question you might have, or where the wondering is that you might have. You can find more about this, by the way, in Bill's work, but this, I think, is a nice, simple way of kind of illustrating or saying it. So, for example, here's an example of framing, or the 4 parts of speech. So, I would like you, I want to talk to you about your action inquiry groups. And in your action inquiry groups, I really expect you to have read each other's work ahead of time, so that you really can get the best out of the experience, right? That's framing. In my experience of doing collaborative developmental action inquiry, I have found that both reading the case twice, offering feedback ahead of time, printing the document and bringing that copy of the document for my peer prior to the case convening time makes for a much better experience. And so I recommend that we all do that too. And I'll give you an example. When I first started doing this work and I didn't do that, there was confusion. It didn't really feel very productive. It wasn't so meaningful. And we ended up actually having a lot of fallout with my peers because clearly we didn't do the work to prepare for each other. So don't you think that it would make for a better opportunity for us if we were to agree now in making sure that we read each other's work ahead of time and offering feedback and comments? What do you think about that? Shall we make that as part of our group process? So that's just an illustration of me going through the 4 parts of speech. It's a little bit clumsy at first and awkward, but it really does make a difference in how you are received when you are working with people and when people are exposing themselves, right? So this is just another way of providing you the tools of the 4 parts of speech. I suggest you try it out. Try it out with a friend, try it out with your partner or your peers ahead of time, and we certainly will have some time to practice this in class when we next meet in March. This is just another way of looking at the territories of experience. So that upper left is really that first person. What's my vision? What's my intention? What's the purpose of this conversation or this interaction? the lower left quadrant, or the second person interpersonal space, is strategies, connections. How am I connecting to my peers? What is the kind of way we're going to become present with each other before we initiate the action inquiry group? The upper right, what's my action? What's my behavior? Am I open to feedback? Am I open to receiving other people's perspective? How am I showing that? What actions am I taking in my way of giving feedback? Am I being mindful of what my preferences are and how my preferences might actually not be in service of someone else's learning? And finally, at the lower right, what are the impacts, the goals, the results as we as a group collectively review and evaluate our experience of action inquiry. Now, developmental action inquiry is really for the purposes of actionable inquiry. In other words, we're really paying attention to our action whilst in inquiry. So notice, what kind of adjustments are you making to your tone or your language use? Or, if you start to fall back into sort of a habitual speech, are you agile enough to kind of shift gears and try out the 4 parts of speech? What kind of adaptations are you and your group kind of engaging in? And are you offering insights for adaptations when you engage each other's cases? And how are you helping each other grow in awareness? The fundamental, qualitative, additive factor for leaders is awareness. And that's coming out in research in the form of mindfulness practices, in the literatures that are really developing this notion of resonance and fundamental qualities or states of leadership. So awareness is a critical component, and all of these tools, the approaches to inquiry, the 4 parts of speech, starting to develop a capacity for the 4 territories of experience, are about increasing awareness, right? Heightening, refining, cultivating this muscle, which turns out to be at the center of good leadership. So there's a lot of information on this slide, and for those of you who have not heard or read or been introduced to single, double, and triple loop feedback or learning, let me give a little bit of some context here. And this comes out of Kurt Lewin's work and Chris Argyris's work and Bill Torbert's work, and all of them are clearly, on the lineage of action science. And some of you who are in Karen Watkins' class or have taken Karen Watkins' class may be very familiar with single and double loop feedback, and those of you who have taken classes with me are aware more of triple loop feedback in addition to single and double. But basically what these things are, this idea of single loop feedback or any loops of feedback are saying that action and learning are very closely intertwined. And if we want to actually learn, we have to pay attention to learning. So learning, even when it is informal, when it is kind of tacit, there is a kind of intentionality that comes of it, because we are in the experience of doing something, and in that experience, when we're starting to train ourselves, we can start to pay attention to what type of learning is required here. So single loop feedback leads to single loop learning, and the focus of single loop feedback is what kinds of micro behavioral adjustments do I need to do to actually accomplish my goal? And usually this is goal-oriented learning that doesn't require me to change. So basically it's about doing something better or faster or more efficiently or with greater effectiveness. It's about behaviorally oriented, or the upper right part of the territories, the external world. How do I change things without changing myself, right? So single loop feedback never leads to radical change or transformative change, but it does lead to adjustments or corrections that might increase your pace, might increase your effectiveness, your efficiency. It might even increase your effectiveness, but won't really change anything, right? So, for example, you find out as a leader that you need to project your voice and sort of develop a tone or a way of speaking, and so you take voice projection lessons in order to Pay attention to that as a leader, right? So that's single loop feedback. Double loop feedback, though, immediately says that, or is kind of focusing on not only the external world, but how you're making the choice of what actions to take. So that's why the focus of double loop feedback is about integrating both single loop adjustments and behavior, but also the double loop focus on the choice behind the behavior, the thinking behind the behavior. So your perception, your assumptions, your beliefs, your values, how might they need adjustment or radical change? So I give a little example here which you guys can read, but basically double loop feedback leads to change, leads to transformative change sometimes, and requires not only just a change in action, but also a change in mind. Now, triple loop feedback and learning is about how do we develop that quality of awareness of being able to see yourself in action, right? So in other words, how am I willing to revision my identity, my sense of self, my vulnerability, my commitments, my integrity in a timely way, so that I am in a very here and now, to use kind of Edgar Schein's language, able to not only make behavioral adjustments, but to also fundamentally recognize how I might be getting in my own way based on values, beliefs, assumptions that are holding that have gone unexamined. So in that moment, am I willing to engage in a more deeper double loop feedback action that actually somehow transforms my very way of acting? Now, triple loop learning is very rare. It doesn't come easy. And I'm mentioning it here just so that you can see the range of these kinds of feedback loops. Predominantly at your early stages of leadership development, we're just barely developing the capacity for single loop feedback. Chris Argyris used to say that it's almost impossible for a system to be a double loop system, or what he called a Model 2 system. And why is that? Because it requires deep, deep self-awareness, a lot of critical reflection, and a kind of agility of change that is rare in leaders and rare in systems that are bureaucratic or institutionalized or ideological in any way. So think about that a little bit more. We'll be discussing this in greater detail, but I just wanted to offer you, again, the reason why this inquiry approach is so critical. It's because it's through inquiry that we learn to pay attention to feedback, to know what feedback to take in and what feedback not to take in, to learn how to ask for feedback, to learn how to inquire so that we can change or lead change or adapt or adjust in a timely fashion. My collaborator, David McCallum, and I have been writing over the past several years about this particular methodology and how it acts both as a theoretical meta framework for moving from, theory to practice, to method of practice. And what that basically means is that, this particular approach to developing the capacity for these approaches to inquiry are established theoretically, right? These are established in principles that have been studied and are continuing to be studied in the field of leadership and the action sciences. As you prepare for our action inquiry groups, I want you to keep in mind that you are, as a group, developing a liberating structure. If you look in part 3, I think, in Bill Torbert's book, he starts to talk about liberating structures or communities of inquiry. And the idea is that, in effect, you can't really engage in double and triple loop learning or feedback unless you have a community of inquiry, and unless you are with a trusted group of friends who are willing to help you see what you cannot, right? We all have blind spots. We know now from leadership studies that it isn't about the great man or great woman theory or great leadership traits. It's about how are we in relationship to ourselves, to others, to our systems, to the very values and beliefs and principles that we want to bring into action, to bring alive through our own being. So a liberating structure really brings that these principles, these ideas that I value myself, I value you, I want us to learn, because it is only through continuous, deep, reflective and critical learning that we actually learn to correct and make more actionable our integrity, our values, our beliefs. So a liberating structure must hold. So we have to decide, how do we trust? How do we communicate? How do we celebrate? How do we, really maintain confidentiality in our group? It must offer support and challenge, and that's what you're going to be doing by offering your peer feedback and comments, both on paper and in face-to-face in our groups. And then it must stick around, so that, you're there you make sure you make a commitment to be there at the sessions, that you do provide feedback, you follow through in what you've promised to do, and that for the duration of the course, you really do pay attention to each other's learning, and hopefully beyond the course, right? There's a natural letting go or moving on when the course ends. But really just play with this notion of, how do we create these microstructures or liberating structures that really are more, that are dynamic, that really take into consideration that, we pay attention to how we form, we pay attention to how we communicate and interact and support and challenge, and we pay attention to how we dissolve. Another model, which I don't particularly like, but Karen Watkins is group forming, storming, norming, performing, all that kind of, sort of a hierarchical strategy. It's not based on the fundamental theories of holding environment, but you might look at the group formation or team formation dynamics of that. And there is some synergy there if you want to look at, how that particular approach to team formation is also in some ways establishing a liberating structure. I offer you this little bit of poetry from David White, whom you now know I really admire and appreciate. But I really just want to, offer you that we're all kind of incomplete. And for a long time, leadership, and particularly leaders, were assumed to be these complete, fully formed people that we could admire and we could be inspired by. And as we have grown in our research and really made contributions and strides in the field of leader and leadership development, what we've discovered is that it is really through knowing our limitations, through knowing that we are more fluid than solid, and knowing that at the heart of leadership are the way that we cultivate our way of being with ourselves and each other and with the world in which we inhabit. And when we start to pay attention to those things, then I think in the process of our becoming, we really do learn to love and not only love each other, but also act in beneficial and timely ways. I wish you a very good day, and thanks for listening.